The chamber went silent the moment the Kreathi speaker pointed a long gray finger at our delegation and said the word feral. I felt my chest tighten before I even understood why. My name is Elena Vasquez, and I was standing 3 steps behind Earth's ambassador when an entire room of alien dignitaries turned to look at us like we were something they had found stuck to the bottom of a shoe. The speaker's voice carried through the translation field, smooth and amused. He said humanity was a species too young to be trusted with its own weapons, too reckless to sit at the same table as civilizations that had been peaceful for 10,000 years. He said it the way someone comments on the weather, casual, certain, final. The laughter came next, not from everyone, but from enough of them. Delegates from 6 different systems, creatures with shells and wings and skin the color of storm clouds, all making the sound their species made when something struck them as ridiculous. I had studied a dozen alien cultures to prepare for this posting, and I still did not know the word for humiliation in any of their languages. I did not need to. The sound in that chamber needed no translation. I looked at our ambassador, Daniel Whitfield, a man who had spent 30 years in diplomatic service and had shaken hands with beings that did not have hands. I expected him to stand taller. I expected fire. Instead, he bowed his head, just slightly, and said that Earth understood the Council's concerns and would take the feedback under advisement. Feedback. He called it feedback. The broadcast feed did not cut away. I found that out later, when it was already too late to matter. Every word, every laugh, every bow of Daniel Whitfield's head had gone out live across every relay station humanity owned, reaching Earth and every colony and every ship in transit within minutes. Billions of people watched their species get laughed at, and then watched their own representative apologize for existing. I stood there in my dress uniform, hands clasped behind my back the way I had been trained to stand, and I felt something shift inside me. It was not anger exactly. Anger burns hot and fast and dies. This was colder, quieter. It settled into my bones like the first frost of winter, and it did not leave. After the session ended, the alien delegates filed out in small clusters, still speaking to each other in low tones, still occasionally glancing back at us with something between pity and contempt. Daniel Whitfield gathered his files without looking at me. I asked him, quietly, why he had not said anything, why he had let them laugh. He told me that Earth's position in the Concord was fragile, that we were still probationary members, still one incident away from expulsion, still dependent on the trade routes and technology transfers that kept our colonies supplied. He said that pride was a luxury we could not afford. I did not argue with him. I had learned long ago that arguing with a man who has already decided he is right accomplishes nothing. But as I walked out of that chamber and into the transit corridor that would take me back to the human quarter of the station, I passed a viewport that looked out over the stars, and I thought about my grandfather. He used to tell me stories about the early days, before the Concord, before any of us knew we were not alone. He said humanity had clawed its way out of caves and plagues and wars that nearly ended everything, and had done it without a single alien hand to help. He said we built rockets out of dreams and desperation, and we did it while still fighting each other over borders that meant nothing from orbit. He said no species had ever earned its place among the stars the way we had. I thought about that as I walked, and I thought about the laughter in that chamber, and I thought about Daniel Whitfield's bowed head. Something in me refused to let that be the end of the story. I did not sleep that night. Instead, I sat in my quarters with the lights off, watching the replay of the session over and over on a private terminal, studying the faces of the delegates who had laughed the loudest. I memorized their names. I memorized which species had stayed silent and which had joined in with open enthusiasm. I told myself I was simply doing my job, gathering intelligence, but I knew that was not the whole truth. I was building a list, and I did not yet know what I planned to do with it. Around 3 a.m, station time, my comm chimed with a message that had no sender listed. That alone should have worried me more than it did. The message contained a single line of text and a set of coordinates for a private channel. The line read, "You saw what I saw. Are you ready to stop apologizing? I sat staring at that message for a long time. Every part of my training told me to report it, to flag it as a potential security risk, to let the proper channels handle whatever this was. But I kept thinking about the laughter, and the bowed head, and the frost that had settled into my chest and refused to melt. I opened the channel. The voice on the other end belonged to a woman who introduced herself only as Bennett. She did not tell me her first name, and I did not ask. She told me that the broadcast had reached every human ear in the Concorde's territory, and that the reaction had not been sadness. It had been something else entirely. She said people were angry in a way she had not seen in her lifetime, and that anger was starting to organize itself into something with structure and purpose. She asked me if I wanted to be part of that structure, or if I wanted to keep standing behind men like Daniel Whitfield while they apologized for the fact that humanity existed. I told her I needed to think about it. She said that was fine, and that she would contact me again soon, and then the channel went dead. I did not think about it for very long. By the time the sun rose over the eastern hemisphere of Earth, more than 6 hours away by the fastest courier ship, I had already made my decision. I would find out what Bennett's network actually was, who was involved, and what they intended to do. Not because I had been ordered to, because I needed to know if there was another way forward, one that did not end with humanity's head bowed forever. What I did not know yet, standing in my quarters with the stars turning slowly outside my window, was that the network Bennett represented was not small, and it was not new. It had been growing quietly for years, built by people who had never trusted the Concorde's promises in the first place, and it was about to pull me into the center of something that would change everything humanity thought it knew about itself. The insult in that chamber had been the spark. What came next would be the fire. I spent the following morning going through official channels, trying to determine whether Daniel Whitfield or anyone above him intended to file a formal protest over the treatment we had received. The answer, delivered to me by a tired-looking aide named Priya Malhotra, was that the ambassador's office considered the matter closed. Earth would not be filing a protest. Earth would not be requesting an apology. Earth would in fact be sending a formal note of gratitude to the Council for its candid feedback, in the hope that such candor would strengthen future cooperation. I read that memo 3 times before I understood it was not a joke. I left the diplomatic offices and walked the long way back to my quarters, past the observation deck where a few dozen humans stationed on the Concorde hub had gathered in small groups, speaking in low voices. I recognized some of them. Engineers, logistics officers. A pilot named Grace Okafor who worked cargo runs between Earth and the outer colonies. None of them looked like people who had accepted the note of gratitude. Grace caught my eye as I passed and gave me a small nod, the kind of nod that says, "I know something you might want to know too." I stopped walking. She stepped away from her group and asked if I had gotten a message the night before. I did not answer directly, but something in my face must have told her enough, because she smiled slightly and said that a lot of people had gotten that same message. She told me there was a meeting happening later that day, in a maintenance bay that officially did not exist on the station's public schematics, and that I was welcome to attend if I wanted to see what humanity actually looked like when it stopped apologizing. I told her I would be there. The rest of that day passed slowly. I attended a routine briefing on trade tariffs that felt utterly meaningless after everything that had happened. I sat through a lunch with 2 colleagues from the diplomatic corps who spent the entire meal debating whether the ambassador's response had been appropriately humble or not humble enough, as if humility were the only quality worth discussing. I said very little. I was thinking about the maintenance bay and about Bennett's voice on the comm channel and about the frost in my chest that had not melted at all. By the time evening fell across the station, marked only by the dimming of the artificial lights along the main corridors, I made my way toward the lower decks, toward a section of the station that human personnel rarely visited because it belonged, on paper, to a private cargo consortium that did not actually exist. I found the entrance exactly where Grace had described it, behind a service panel marked with a hazard symbol that had clearly been placed there to discourage curious eyes. I knocked twice, the way she had told me to, and waited. The panel slid open, and I stepped through into a room that would change the rest of my life. The room behind the service panel was larger than I expected, lit by portable work lamps instead of the station's regular lighting grid, which told me immediately that whoever ran this space did not want it appearing on any power consumption log. Perhaps 40 people stood or sat around makeshift tables built from cargo containers. I recognized maybe a third of them from the diplomatic corps and the station's technical staff. The rest were strangers, and something about the way they carried themselves told me they were not diplomats or engineers in any official sense. Bennett found me within seconds of my arrival. She turned out to be a compact woman with silver hair cropped close to her scalp and eyes that seemed to measure everything they looked at. She did not offer a handshake. She simply said that she was glad I had come, and that time was short, and that I should listen before I asked questions. She led me to the center of the room, where a holographic display hovered above a container lid, showing a star map dotted with small blue markers. She explained that each marker represented a location where a human vessel or installation had, over the years, quietly exceeded the technological restrictions placed on our species by the Concord's treaties. Fusion drives registered as industrial equipment, weapons systems built into cargo ships and labeled as mining tools, research stations disguised as agricultural outposts running experiments the Concorde had explicitly forbidden. I asked her how long this had been happening. She told me 11 years, the entire span of our probationary membership. I felt something cold settle deeper into my chest, but this time it was not only anger. It was something closer to understanding. I had spent my career believing that Earth's weakness in the Concorde was real, that we genuinely lacked the strength to stand as equals among older civilizations. Bennett was telling me that belief had been manufactured, carefully maintained, by people who understood that appearing weak was safer than being seen as a threat before we were ready. I asked her who was behind it. She said the honest answer was almost everyone who mattered. Governments that publicly disagreed on nearly every issue back on Earth had quietly cooperated on this one project, funneling resources through private companies and shell corporations that the Concorde's inspectors had never managed to fully untangle. She said it had taken extraordinary discipline to keep the secret for so long, and extraordinary patience to wait for the right moment to reveal it. I asked her if last night's insult was that moment. She said it might be, but the decision was not hers to make alone. She said the network had built the capability. What it lacked was the will, spread wide enough across enough of humanity to actually use it. She said the broadcast of the council session had done something no amount of planning could have accomplished. It had given millions of ordinary people a reason to stop asking whether standing up for ourselves was worth the risk. A man stepped forward from the crowd, tall with weathered features, and a voice that carried the particular flatness of someone who had spent decades in military command. He introduced himself as Marcus Cole, formerly of Earth's Joint Defense Coalition, now serving in a capacity he described only as advisory. He told the room that the fleets existed, hidden across a dozen systems, disguised as everything from research vessels to asteroid mining rigs. He told us the numbers, and I watched the faces around me change as they absorbed what those numbers meant. This was not a handful of secret ships. This was a force large enough to matter. Cole explained that the network had always intended to reveal itself eventually, but the original plan called for a slow, careful unveiling, timed to avoid triggering panic among the Concorde's member species or provoking a preemptive strike against Earth before our full strength could be demonstrated. He said that plan had assumed humanity would have years to prepare public opinion, years to build alliances with sympathetic factions inside the Concorde who might soften the reaction to our revelation. He said last night had erased those years. The room fell quiet as he spoke. He said that whether we liked it or not, the choice had been made for us. The insult had been broadcast to every human ear across Concorde space, and the anger it produced was not going to fade quietly. People were already organizing, already talking, already asking questions their governments could no longer avoid answering. If the network did not control the reveal now, on its own terms, someone else would force the issue in a far less controlled way, and the results could be catastrophic. I asked what controlled reveal meant in practice. Cole looked at me for a long moment before answering. He said it meant showing the Concord, all at once, exactly what humanity had built while pretending to be weak. Not as an attack, not as a declaration of war, simply as an undeniable fact, presented calmly and without apology, that would force every species in that chamber to recalculate everything they believed about us. Bennett added that the goal was never violence. She said the entire purpose of the network's work had been to ensure that humanity never again had to bow its head in a room full of people laughing at us. Strength, she said, was not something you used. It was something you had, so that you never had to prove it through force. The demonstration itself would be the message. I sat with that for a while, listening as the discussion around me grew louder, more urgent, more specific. Engineers debated logistics. Former officers debated formations and timing. A young woman named Priya, not the same Priya from the ambassador's office but a different one entirely, argued passionately that the reveal needed to happen everywhere at once, that a staggered approach would give the Concord time to prepare a response and possibly turn the narrative against us before it even began. I found myself drawn into the conversation almost without deciding to be. Someone asked what I knew about the ambassador's office, about how quickly official channels might move if word of tonight's meeting somehow reached them. I explained what I had seen that morning, the memo about gratitude, the closed door on any formal protest. The room absorbed this with grim satisfaction, as if it confirmed something they had already suspected. The official channels would not act. They had already decided that swallowing insult was safer than risking confrontation. Bennett asked me directly whether I would help. Not as a soldier, since I had no military background beyond basic diplomatic security training, but as someone who understood how the Concord's institutions worked from the inside, someone who could help translate the network's intentions into language the Council would be forced to take seriously when the moment came. I thought about Daniel Whitfield bowing his head. I thought about the note of gratitude the ambassador's office intended to send. I thought about my grandfather's stories, about rockets built from dreams and desperation, about a species that had never once been given anything it did not have to fight for. I said yes. The meeting continued long into the night. I learned more in those hours than I had in years of diplomatic briefings. I learned the rough locations of the hidden fleets, the estimated timelines for full readiness, the names of key figures across dozens of governments who had spent over a decade keeping this secret buried. I learned that the network had a name, though it was rarely spoken aloud even within its own ranks. They called it simply the undertaking, a word chosen deliberately because it described both the enormous project itself and the promise embedded within it, a promise that Earth would never again be caught unprepared. Near the end of the meeting, Cole raised the question that everyone in the room had been circling around without quite asking directly. If the decision was made to move forward, who would give the order, and how quickly could it be executed? Bennett answered before anyone else could. She said the order would not come from any single person, not from a president or a general or a council of elders hidden away on Earth. She said the entire point of the undertaking had been to build something distributed, something no single act of sabotage or coercion could unravel. The commanders of each hidden fleet had standing authorization to act the moment a specific signal was broadcast across the network's private channels, a signal that could be triggered by consensus among the coordination cell present in this very room. I asked how close that consensus already was. Nobody answered immediately. Cole finally said that after tonight, after hearing the reports coming in from Earth and the colonies, after seeing the anger spreading faster than anyone had predicted, he believed the consensus was closer than any of them had expected it to be 24 hours earlier. Someone suggested calling for a vote right then, in that room, among the people gathered. Bennett shook her head, and said the coordination cell needed to consult with the fleet commanders directly before anything so significant could move forward. She said this was not a decision to make in haste, even if haste was exactly what the moment seemed to demand. The meeting broke up sometime after midnight, station time, with an agreement that a final coordination session would happen within the next day, once responses had come in from the scattered commanders across the hidden fleets. I walked back to my quarters through corridors that felt different than they had that morning, though nothing about them had actually changed. It was I who had changed, carrying inside me now a secret large enough to reshape the balance of power among the stars. I did not sleep again that night either. I lay awake replaying everything Bennett and Cole had said, turning over the weight of what I now knew. Somewhere out among the stars, disguised as mining ships and research stations, humanity's true strength waited in silence, ready to answer for 11 years of pretending to be small. I thought about Daniel Whitfield, still asleep somewhere in the diplomatic quarters, still believing that gratitude and humility were the only tools available to a species like ours. I wondered what he would think when he learned the truth. I wondered what the Creathi speaker would think, and all the delegates who had laughed when they discovered exactly what they had been laughing at. By the time the artificial dawn cycle began to lighten the corridors outside my window, I understood that the vote Bennett had spoken of was no longer a distant possibility. It was coming, and coming quickly, and I would be there when it happened. What none of us in that hidden room fully understood yet was how fast the responses from the fleet commanders would arrive, or how unanimous they would be. The insult in the council chamber had reached every corner of human space within hours. The anger it produced had not needed a day to organize. It had needed only a spark, and the spark had already been struck. Bennett called me back to the maintenance bay less than 18 hours after our first meeting, and this time the room was fuller, tighter, humming with an energy that felt different from the cautious excitement of the night before. Something had shifted. I could feel it the moment I stepped through the service panel. Cole was already speaking when I arrived, standing beside the holographic star map, which now showed far more markers than it had before. He explained that responses from the fleet commanders had come in faster and with more unity than anyone in the coordination cell had expected. Of the dozen major commanders overseeing the hidden fleets, 11 had already voted in favor of moving forward. The 12th had not voted against it, only requested additional time to secure a vulnerable supply line before committing. I asked what moving forward actually meant in concrete terms. Bennett told me it meant the beginning of what the undertaking called the ledger phase, a process of formally documenting and verifying every piece of hidden technology, every disguised vessel, every quietly developed weapon system, so that when the moment came to reveal everything, the presentation would be accurate, undeniable, and impossible for the Concord to dismiss as exaggeration or bluff. She explained that the ledger itself was not simply a list. It was closer to an inventory built over more than a decade by engineers, logisticians, and scientists who had never met each other in person, coordinating instead through encrypted channels and dead drops, each contributing a small piece to something none of them had ever seen in its entirety. Only a handful of people, Bennett among them, held anything close to a complete picture. I asked to see it. She hesitated, which surprised me. Bennett had not struck me as someone who hesitated easily. She finally said that showing me the ledger meant trusting me completely, and trust like that was not something the undertaking extended lightly, even to people who had already agreed to help. I told her that if I was going to stand in front of the Concord one day and vouch for whatever this network had built, I needed to know exactly what I was vouching for. She studied me for a long moment, then nodded, and gestured for me to follow her deeper into the maintenance bay, through a second hidden door I had not noticed the night before. The room beyond was small, windowless, containing only a single terminal and 2 chairs. Bennett sat, entered a lengthy authorization sequence, and the screen filled with data. What I saw over the next several hours reshaped my understanding of my own species entirely. The ledger cataloged technology that went far beyond what Cole had described in general terms the night before. fusion drive systems capable of speeds the Concorde had explicitly forbidden any probationary member from developing, installed quietly into vessels registered as ordinary bulk cargo haulers. Energy shielding technology adapted from principles the Concorde had shared with older member species but withheld from Earth, reverse-engineered by human scientists working in secret over the better part of a decade. Weapons platforms disguised within asteroid mining equipment, carrying enough firepower to make any single one of these vessels a match for ships several times its registered class. But it was not only weapons. The ledger also documented medical advances, communication networks, and terraforming technologies that Earth had developed independently rather than wait for the Concorde's slow and often politically motivated technology-sharing agreements. I realized as I read through entry after entry that the secrecy had never been solely about weapons. It had been about independence itself, about a species refusing to remain dependent on the goodwill of others who had shown, again and again, exactly how little goodwill they actually held toward us. I asked Bennett how something this vast had remained hidden for so long. She explained that the key had never been perfect secrecy in any single location, but rather redundancy and misdirection spread across so many disguised projects that no single Concorde inspection, however thorough, could uncover more than a fragment of the whole picture. Inspectors who grew suspicious of one facility would find nothing but legitimate agricultural research. Auditors who questioned unusual cargo manifests would find paperwork that, while unusual, never quite crossed the line into an actionable violation. The entire system had been built by people who understood bureaucracy as well as they understood engineering, and who had used that understanding to bury the truth beneath mountains of technically accurate documentation. I asked her the question that had been building in me since the night before. I asked why, if all of this had existed for years, humanity had continued to let itself be treated as inferior in every Concorde interaction. Why endure insult after insult, small and large, when the strength to answer differently had been sitting quietly in the dark the entire time? Bennett's answer was quieter than I expected. She said that revealing strength too early carried enormous risk. The Concorde's older species vastly outnumbered humanity across known space. A premature reveal, especially one that came across as threatening rather than simply confident, could have triggered a coalition response that no amount of hidden technology could withstand. The entire strategy had depended on patience, on waiting until human capability had grown wide and deep enough that no single retaliatory action could meaningfully threaten it, and on waiting for a moment when public sentiment, both among humans and potentially among sympathetic factions within the Concorde, would support rather than fear the revelation. She said last night's broadcast had accelerated everything, compressing a timeline that had been designed to unfold over years into something that now had to happen in days, possibly hours. The risk of moving too early remained real. But the coordination cell had come to believe that the risk of waiting any longer, of allowing humanity's public humiliation to fester without response, had become greater still. I spent the rest of that day inside the maintenance bay, absorbing details I would need if I was ever going to stand credibly in front of Concorde officials and explain what humanity had built and why. Cole walked me through fleet dispositions, explaining which vessels were positioned near which colonies, which systems held the greatest concentration of hidden strength, and how the planned reveal would unfold if the final vote passed. Engineers explained technical specifications in language simple enough for me to grasp without a background in astrophysics. A quiet, careful man named Julian Okoye, who I later learned had spent 15 years designing the shielding systems now protecting a third of the hidden fleet, spoke with me for nearly an hour about the philosophy behind the entire project, about wanting Earth to never again face a threat unprepared the way it so often had in its own turbulent history. As evening approached, word came through the network's channels that the 12th Fleet Commander, the one who had requested additional time, had secured the vulnerable supply line and cast a vote in favor of moving forward. The consensus Bennett had spoken of the night before was now complete. Every commander overseeing every hidden fleet across human-controlled space had agreed. The only question remaining was timing. Cole called the coordination cell together one final time that evening. He explained that the plan under consideration involved a coordinated decloaking of every disguised vessel simultaneously, timed to occur at dawn, across the greatest possible number of relevant systems, a symbolic choice meant to represent not an ending but a beginning. He stressed again that the intention was never violence. No weapons would be armed, no hostile action would be taken. The fleets would simply become visible, undeniable, present in numbers and capability that no observer could dismiss or explain away. He said the message accompanying the reveal needed to be carefully chosen, calm rather than triumphant, confident rather than boastful. He said the entire point was to force a recalculation, not to provoke a war. Bennett suggested that the message should come not from a general or a politician, but from someone who had stood in that council chamber and witnessed the insult firsthand, someone who could speak to what it had actually felt like to be laughed at, and could deliver the response with the same measured dignity that the ambassador had failed to show. Every eye in the room turned toward me. I had not expected this. I told them I was not qualified, that I held no rank beyond junior attaché, that surely someone with more authority should deliver a message this significant. Bennett said authority was exactly the problem. Every official channel had already proven, through Daniel Whitfield's apology and the ambassador's office's memo about gratitude, that it would choose humility over dignity every single time. She said what the moment required was someone who represented ordinary humanity's response to being humiliated, not another layer of diplomatic caution. Cole added that my presence in that chamber during the original insult and my willingness to walk away from official channels and join the undertaking within a single day made me exactly the right person to carry the message. He said credibility mattered more than rank, and I had already proven where my loyalties stood. I sat with the weight of that request for a long moment. I thought about the frost that had settled into my chest 2 nights before and had never once melted. I thought about Daniel Whitfield's bowed head and the laughter that had echoed through that chamber, and the memo about gratitude sitting unanswered in my terminal back at the diplomatic offices. I thought about my grandfather and rockets built from dreams and desperation, and a species that had clawed its way this far without ever once being given anything freely. I told them I would do it. The room seemed to exhale as one. Bennett nodded once, satisfied, and began outlining the specific timing of the plan. The decloaking would occur at dawn, calculated across Earth's own time zone despite the fact that the fleets themselves spanned a dozen systems light-years apart, because dawn carried meaning that no other hour could replicate. It would mark the moment humanity stopped hiding and started standing. I spent the final hours before the operation reviewing the message I intended to deliver, writing and rewriting it, trying to find words that carried the weight of everything humanity had endured, without tipping over into anger that might be mistaken for aggression. Bennett read several drafts and offered small suggestions, always pushing me toward simplicity, toward statements that could not be twisted or misquoted by anyone hoping to paint humanity as the aggressor. As the final hours ticked away, word came through the network that Earth's official government, the same government that had funded and protected the undertaking for over a decade without ever publicly acknowledging it, had formally authorized the reveal. Every treaty that had governed the terms of humanity's probationary membership, every restriction on technology and weapons and independent development, would be declared void the moment the fleets became visible. There would be no attempt to pretend the secrecy of the past decade had been an accident or a misunderstanding. Earth intended to own what it had built, openly and without apology. I thought about the word apology and how strange it felt now, knowing what I knew. I thought about how differently that council session might have gone if Daniel Whitfield had understood, even slightly, the strength that had been waiting quietly behind humanity's supposedly humble position. I wondered whether he would understand, when dawn came, exactly what his apology had cost him and what it would now be replaced with. There was no time left for wondering. The coordination cell finalized the last details as the artificial night cycle deepened around the station. Somewhere across a dozen systems, commanders who had waited years for this moment prepared their disguised vessels for a transformation that would announce itself to the entire Concord at once. I sat in the small windowless room with Bennett, running through my message one final time, feeling the frost in my chest finally begin to shift into something that felt, for the first time since that terrible council session, almost like hope. Dawn was coming, and with it, everything was about to change. I stood on the bridge of a vessel I had not even known existed until 3 days earlier, a ship called the Clear Horizon that had spent the last 6 years registered as an agricultural survey craft, quietly patrolling the outer edge of a trade corridor, while carrying enough hidden capability to make any Concord patrol think twice before approaching. Cole had arranged for me to be aboard for the reveal itself, insisting that if I was going to deliver humanity's message, I should do it from a vessel that embodied exactly what that message represented. The bridge crew moved with quiet efficiency around me, a mix of former military officers and civilian engineers who had trained together for this exact moment, without ever fully believing it would come this soon. A woman named Fiona Marsh sat at the primary console, her hands steady, despite the enormity of what was about to happen. She had spent 4 years disguising this very ship's systems from Concord inspectors, and now she was about to reveal every one of them at once. The countdown Cole had established synchronized across every hidden fleet, timed to Earth's own rotation so that dawn would break simultaneously in meaning, if not in literal daylight, across every relevant system. I watched the mission clock tick down, feeling my pulse match its rhythm, feeling the frost in my chest settle into something steadier, something closer to resolve than fear. At 3 minutes before the mark, Fiona's console lit up with confirmation signals arriving from across the network, each hidden fleet reporting readiness, each commander confirming their vessels stood prepared to decloak on schedule. I watched the star map on the bridge's main display fill with markers, dozens at first, then hundreds, spread across systems I had only ever seen listed in briefing documents. The scale of what humanity had built finally became visible to me in a way the ledger's cold data had never quite captured. This was not an abstraction. This was real, and it was enormous, and in less than 3 minutes it would no longer be a secret. At 1 minute, Cole's voice came through the ship's comm system, relayed from the coordination center back on Earth where the final authorization had been given. He did not shout or add drama to the moment. He simply confirmed that all systems remained green across the network and that the operation would proceed as planned. I thought, in that final minute, about everyone who had built this in secret for over a decade without ever expecting recognition. Engineers like Julian Okoye, who had designed shielding systems he might never be publicly credited for. Commanders who had spent years commanding disguised vessels, following orders to remain hidden even when every instinct told them to reveal their strength. Ordinary workers on 100 worlds who had built components for projects they were told were agricultural equipment, never knowing the truth, trusting a government that had, for once, actually earned that trust. At 0, the world changed. Across a dozen systems simultaneously, the cloaking fields and false registrations that had disguised humanity's true strength for over a decade dropped away all at once. On the bridge of the Clear Horizon, I watched our own vessel's disguise fall from the outside through a secondary feed relayed from a nearby scout ship, watching what had appeared to be a simple agricultural survey craft reveal itself as something far more formidable, its true hull lines emerging from beneath the camouflage that had hidden them, weapon systems and shielding arrays becoming visible for the first time to any outside observer. Across the network, similar transformations were happening everywhere at once. Mining rigs revealed weapons platforms capable of matching anything in the Concord's own arsenals. Research stations revealed themselves as fully operational military installations. Cargo haulers revealed fusion drive systems that exceeded anything the Concorde had ever permitted a probationary member to develop. And above it all, in systems close enough to Concorde command stations to matter, Entire fleets that had never officially existed suddenly filled the sensor readings of alien observers who had spent years believing humanity possessed nothing beyond what the treaties allowed. The reaction across Concord communication channels was immediate and chaotic. I listened as Fiona monitored the intercepted traffic, watching confusion ripple outward from station to station as alien commanders scrambled to understand what they were suddenly seeing. Some channels carried outright panic. Others carried disbelief, officers insisting the readings must be some kind of error or elaborate deception. A few, the ones that worried Cole the most when he relayed updates to the bridge, carried the early stirrings of what might become a hostile response. Defensive systems moving to alert status across several Concord military installations. This was the moment everything Bennett and Cole had planned for depended on restraint. No human vessel fired. No human commander gave an order that could be mistaken for aggression. The fleets simply held position, visible now in their full strength, present but motionless, a demonstration rather than an attack. I understood, watching the tension ripple across the intercepted channels, exactly how fragile this moment was. A single mistake, a single itchy trigger finger on either side, could turn a demonstration of strength into something far more catastrophic. It was time for my message. Cole's voice came through again, quieter this time, telling me the broadcast channel was open and reaching every Concord communication network simultaneously. The same networks that had carried the laughter in that council chamber only 2 days earlier. I stood at the center of the Clear Horizons bridge, Fiona nodding to confirm the feed was live, and I spoke the words I had spent hours refining. I told them my name and my role, that I had stood in the council chamber and heard humanity called feral, heard laughter fill a room built to represent civilizations far older than our own. I told them that for 11 years, Earth had accepted a position of humility that had never reflected the truth of who we were, choosing patience over pride because patience seemed the safer path toward eventual acceptance among the stars. I told them that patience had run out, not because humanity had grown angry beyond reason, but because we had finally understood that acceptance offered in exchange for humiliation was never acceptance worth having. I told them that everything they were now seeing across their sensor readings had existed for years, built quietly and carefully by people who had never stopped believing humanity deserved better than what the council chamber had offered. I told them we had not revealed ourselves to threaten anyone. No weapon aboard any vessel in that fleet had been armed. No hostile action had been taken or was intended. We had revealed ourselves simply because the alternative, continuing to accept insult while hiding our true strength, no longer made sense once the world had watched its representatives laughed at and had watched that representative apologize instead of standing firm. I told them the treaties that had governed humanity's probationary membership, treaties that had restricted our development while asking for gratitude in return, would be considered void as of this moment. I told them Earth did not intend to attack the Concord, did not intend to abandon diplomacy, and remained willing to build genuine relationships with any species willing to treat us as equals rather than subjects to be managed and mocked. I told them, finally, that we were done apologizing for existing, done bowing our heads in rooms full of laughter, done pretending weakness to make others comfortable. I told them that whatever came next, whether cooperation or conflict, would be decided going forward on terms that respected humanity's actual strength rather than the fiction we had allowed to stand for over a decade. I stopped speaking, and for a long moment the bridge remained utterly silent except for the low hum of the ship's systems. Fiona confirmed the broadcast had reached every intended channel. Cole's voice came through once more, quieter than before, simply saying that it was done and that now the Concord would decide how to respond. We did not have to wait long. Within an hour, the chaotic scramble across Concord communication channels began to settle into something more organized, though whether that organization pointed toward negotiation or confrontation remained unclear from the fragments Fiona could intercept. Reports came in of Concord fleets adjusting positions across several systems, though none moved to directly engage the now visible human vessels. Diplomatic channels, silent for hours after the initial chaos, slowly began reopening, carrying formal requests for communication from several Concord member species who had clearly recalculated their previous assumptions about humanity's capabilities. I remained on the Clear Horizons bridge through those tense hours, watching updates arrive from across the network, feeling the weight of what we had done settle over me in waves. This was not a victory yet. It was, at best, the beginning of something that could still go badly wrong if either side made the wrong choice in the hours ahead. But it was also, undeniably, an ending. The version of humanity that had bowed its head in that council chamber, that had accepted a memo about gratitude as an appropriate response to public humiliation, no longer existed. Whatever came next, it would come to a different Earth than the one that had entered that chamber 2 days earlier. News eventually reached us that the Concord had called for an emergency session, requesting Earth's presence, though notably not through Daniel Whitfield's office, which had apparently been sidelined entirely once word of the undertaking became public knowledge among Earth's own population. The request instead came through channels Bennett's network controlled directly, a small but significant detail that told me exactly how thoroughly the balance of power had shifted in a matter of hours. Cole informed me, as the Clear Horizon held its position among the newly visible fleet, that I had been asked to attend that emergency session, not as an observer this time, but as Earth's chosen voice, the person who had delivered the message that ended 11 years of manufactured humility. I sat with that request for a long moment, thinking about how strange it felt to go from a silent attaché, standing 3 steps behind an apologetic ambassador, to the person now expected to speak for an entire species in front of the same chamber that had laughed at us only 2 days before. I told Cole I would go. As the Clear Horizon began its slow journey toward the coordinates of the emergency session, I found myself standing at the viewport, looking out at the fleet arrayed around us. Ships that had spent years pretending to be something small and harmless, now finally standing in the open as exactly what they had always been. I thought about my grandfather again, about rockets built from dreams and desperation, and I thought that whatever waited for us in that chamber, humanity would walk in this time with its head held high. Dawn had come, exactly as planned, and by the time it broke fully across every system that mattered, every treaty that had defined humanity's place among the stars had already turned to dust, replaced by something we had built ourselves, in secret, over 11 long years of quiet patience that had finally, completely, run out. The council chamber looked different this time, though nothing about its architecture had changed. The same curved walls, the same rows of seating arranged in a wide circle, so that no single delegation could claim the position of highest authority, the same translation field humming faintly at the center of the room. What had changed was the way every set of eyes turned toward our delegation the moment we entered, and the way none of them held even a trace of the laughter I remembered from 2 days earlier. I walked in beside Bennett and Cole, with a small delegation of engineers and former officers trailing behind us, people who had spent years building the strength that now stood revealed across a dozen systems. We were not accompanied by Daniel Whitfield. His office had sent formal notice that he remained available to assist in any transition of diplomatic responsibility, phrasing that Bennett had read aloud to me with a small, humorless laugh, noting that even now, facing a completely transformed situation, the old diplomatic instincts could not resist softening every statement into something apologetic. The Creathi speaker occupied the same central podium he had stood at during the original session, though his posture now carried none of the casual amusement I remembered. He watched our delegation take our seats with an expression I could not immediately read, something between wariness and calculation. Around the chamber, other delegates who had laughed loudest during the original insult now sat very still, several of them exchanging quiet, urgent conversations with aides who kept glancing toward data displays showing what I assumed were updated readings of the newly visible human fleets. The session opened without the usual ceremonial preamble. The speaker addressed our delegation directly, his translated voice carrying none of its previous amusement, asking simply for an explanation of what the Concorde sensors had recorded across a dozen systems within the last day. Bennett had insisted, back on the clear horizon, that I should be the one to answer, that the message I had already delivered across every Concorde channel should be reinforced now, in person, by the same voice that had spoken it. I rose from my seat, feeling the weight of every eye in that chamber, and found that the frost in my chest had settled into something entirely different now. Not anger, not fear, simply clarity. I told the speaker that the explanation had already been broadcast across every relevant channel, but that I would summarize it again for the benefit of anyone in the chamber who required clarity. I told him that for 11 years, humanity had developed technology and maintained military capability far beyond what the treaties governing our probationary membership permitted, doing so quietly and deliberately, while publicly presenting ourselves as the humble, developing species the Concorde had assumed us to be. A ripple of reaction moved through the chamber at that admission, though it was quieter than the laughter I remembered from before. This time, the reaction carried the particular stillness of beings recalculating a threat assessment in real time. I told the speaker that the decision to reveal this capability now, rather than continue the original plan of a slow, carefully managed disclosure over the coming years, had been made in direct response to the treatment our species received in this very chamber 2 days earlier. I told him that watching our ambassador apologize for an insult rather than answer it had made clear that continuing to present ourselves as weak, in the hope that humility would eventually earn respect, was a strategy that had already failed and would continue to fail indefinitely. The speaker's translated voice, when he responded, carried a note of something I had not expected. Not anger, not defensiveness, but a kind of careful, deliberate calculation, the voice of someone recalculating a relationship he had assumed was settled and now understood to be anything but. He asked whether humanity's intention, given this revealed capability, was hostile toward the Concorde. I told him, clearly and without hesitation, that it was not. I told him that not a single weapon among the fleets, now visible across a dozen systems, had been armed, and that no hostile action had been taken against any Concorde vessel or installation, despite the significant capability now on display. I told him that humanity's goal had never been conquest or confrontation, but simply the ability to stand in chambers like this one as equals, respected for our actual strength rather than managed and mocked for a weakness we had never truly possessed. I told him that the treaties governing our probationary membership, treaties that had restricted our development, while offering only conditional and often condescending acceptance in return, were no longer treaties Earth considered binding. I told him that if the Concorde wished to build a new relationship with humanity going forward, that relationship would need to begin from a position of mutual respect rather than hierarchy, negotiated openly rather than imposed by a council that had, until recently, felt entitled to laugh at us without consequence. The chamber remained silent for a long moment after I finished speaking. Several delegates conferred quietly with their aides. The speaker himself seemed to be weighing his response carefully, and I found myself grateful for every hour Bennett had spent helping me refine my words, grateful that nothing I had said could easily be twisted into an accusation of aggression, even as it left no room for doubt about where humanity now stood. A delegate from one of the smaller Concorde member species, a being with pale, shifting skin whose translated voice carried a tone of genuine curiosity rather than hostility, asked why humanity had chosen to reveal everything at once rather than continue the gradual approach I had described. I answered honestly, telling her that the original plan had assumed years of careful preparation, but that watching billions of humans witness their own species mocked, and their representative apologize, had made clear that continued patience was no longer sustainable, either politically or morally. I told her that a species cannot indefinitely ask its people to accept humiliation in exchange for eventual acceptance that may never actually arrive. Another delegate, one of the larger, more heavily armored representatives whose species I recognized as having been among the original ruling council's founding members, asked a harder question. He asked whether the Concorde could trust an assurance of peaceful intent from a species that had spent 11 years deliberately deceiving every inspection and every treaty obligation placed upon it? I did not flinch from that question, though I understood exactly how difficult it was to answer well. I told him that the deception had been born from necessity rather than malice, a direct response to restrictions that had never been applied evenly or fairly across the Concord's membership. I told him that older, more established species had never been asked to develop under the same restrictive conditions Earth had accepted upon joining, and that humanity's choice to quietly exceed those restrictions reflected a desire for genuine security rather than any intention toward aggression. I told him that trust, going forward, would need to be built the same way it is built between any two parties who have reason to be wary of each other, through consistent action over time rather than a single dramatic gesture in either direction. He studied me for a long moment before responding, his translated voice carrying something that might have been grudging respect, though I could not be entirely certain given how unfamiliar his species' vocal patterns remained to me. He said that humanity's answer, whatever else could be said about it, was considerably more direct than anything his species had come to expect from our diplomatic corps. Bennett, seated beside me, allowed herself a small, controlled smile at that comment. The session continued for several more hours, delegates from across the Concord raising questions, expressing concerns, occasionally attempting to test whether our newfound confidence might crack under sustained pressure. I answered each question as honestly and directly as I could, drawing on everything I had learned during those intense days inside the maintenance bay, everything Bennett and Cole and Julian Okoye and countless others had built and taught me. I found, somewhere in the middle of that long session, that the fear I had expected to feel standing before this chamber again had simply never arrived. In its place was something steadier, something that felt, for the first time in my career, like actually representing my species rather than apologizing for its existence. Toward the end of the session, the speaker raised the question that had clearly been building throughout the entire exchange. He asked what humanity now wanted from the Concord, given that the previous treaties no longer held and no new agreement yet existed to replace them. I told him that humanity wanted what should have been offered from the beginning, a seat at this table earned through demonstrated capability rather than granted through conditional tolerance. I told him we wanted trade relationships negotiated on fair terms, access to shared knowledge and resources on the same basis extended to any other established member species, and an end to the kind of casual disrespect that had defined our interactions with this council since the day we first arrived among the stars. I told him, finally, that humanity did not require the Concord's approval to continue existing and continuing to grow, that we had proven over the past 11 years that we were capable of building whatever we needed on our own if cooperation was not offered in good faith. But I told him that we would genuinely prefer partnership over isolation, cooperation over conflict, provided that partnership came without the condescension that had defined every previous interaction. The speaker was quiet for a long moment after I finished, the entire chamber holding its collective breath, waiting to see how this reshaped balance of power would settle. When he finally spoke, his translated voice carried a measured formality I had not heard from him before, an acknowledgement, however reluctant, that the species he had mocked 2 days earlier could no longer be dismissed with laughter. He proposed that a formal negotiation process begin immediately, to establish new terms governing humanity's relationship with the Concord, terms that would need to reflect, in his words, a considerably more accurate understanding of our species' actual capabilities and standing than the previous treaties had assumed. I looked toward Bennett, who gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod. I turned back to the speaker and told him that Earth would welcome that negotiation, on the condition that it began from a position of equality rather than hierarchy, and that any future insult delivered in this chamber would be answered directly, by us, rather than apologized for on our behalf. The speaker inclined his head slightly, a gesture I had come to understand, over years of diplomatic study, as the closest thing his species offered to genuine respect. The session adjourned shortly afterward, with formal negotiations scheduled to begin within the week, this time with humanity's delegation led not by Daniel Whitfield, but by people who had spent the last decade building the strength to earn a seat at this table on our own terms. As we filed out of the chamber, I found myself walking past the same viewport I had passed 2 days earlier, the one that looked out over the stars, and had prompted me to think of my grandfather's stories. I stopped there again, briefly, looking out at the same distant lights, though everything about how I saw them now felt different. 2 days ago I had felt small standing before that view, uncertain whether humanity would ever truly belong among these stars. Now I understood that we had never needed anyone's permission to belong. We had simply needed to stop apologizing for the fact that we already did. Bennett found me there and asked if I was ready for what came next, the long process of building an entirely new relationship between Earth and a Concord that would need years to fully adjust to a species it could no longer afford to underestimate. I told her I was. Behind us, across a dozen systems, humanity's fleet still stood visible, no longer hidden, no longer disguised, simply present, exactly as strong as they had always secretly been. The insult that had started everything, spoken so casually in a chamber full of laughter, had ended not with an apology, but with an entirely new table, one that humanity had built for itself and would now, finally, sit at as an equal. By dawn, every treaty that had once defined our place among the stars had turned to dust. What rose in its place, built from 11 years of quiet patience and a single unforgettable moment of insult, was something far stronger, something no council chamber would ever again mistake for weakness. And as I stood at that viewport, watching the stars that had once seemed so distant and unwelcoming, I understood that this was not the end of humanity's story among the Concord. It was only the beginning of a chapter finally written on our own terms.